So let me just begin by with a brief introduction, just to mention that we're grateful to the Kellogg Institute for the generous funding for this event. As you know, this is part of the
That's very highly common.
The development economics course. They were honored to welcome Kevin Munshi, the Frederick Beinicki, is that correct? Beinicki, professor of economics at Yale University. He is the recipient of the prestigious 2016 Infosys Prize for Social Sciences, which is given annually to honor outstanding achievements. The contemporary researchers. It is India's most prestigious research prize. The research has been published in a variety of top journals, including the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, Review of Economic Studies, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, the Review of Economics and Statistics, and the Journal of Development Economics. This research, which centers on the multifaceted role played by informal community institutions in the process of development, is widely recognized, and he has also been the editor of the Journal of Development Economics. He's a fellow of the CEPR. He's a IFS in England and bred. So we're delighted to welcome you to Notre Dame. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, and it's nice to be back here again after a few years. The same series, so maybe the last, given my age, but nevertheless, it's nice to be here. And many familiar faces. In fact, I remember trying to recruit Tara when she was on the job market, fresh out of her PhD. So we were both much younger.
Much older now.
So anyways, let me jump straight in because I should warn you, for those of you who were at my lecture yesterday, there was a lot of ground that I covered. Well, it's the same here, okay? So be prepared. It's going to keep going. You'll think it stopped, but then there'll be another, it's like one of those horror movies where you have yet another section to go. So let me jump straight in, okay? So this research is motivated by this observation that female labor force non-participation, we're going to use this term all the time for a reason, as you will see, is extremely high and has increased even further over time in many developing economies. And here is a figure that I think will help you see what we're talking about. So the left panel, what you have, the black line is the GDP per capita, or the log GDP per capita in India from the late 1990s all the way up to 2018. And you can see here, this has been growing pretty much at a steady rate over this time period. And we all know this. This is the time when the Indian economy has been growing quite rapidly with the restructuring, the financial liberalization, the economic liberalization, etc. Now, the red line is the female labor force non-participation for rural Indian women. So the way that India is divided up administratively is that is unlike the US, where you have rural counties and urban metropolitan area metropolitan areas. In India, every district has a rural part and an urban part. Obviously, there are some districts which are going to be largely urban, like the Bombay district, that obviously that's going to be almost entirely urban. But every district in principle has, these two components to it. And we're looking here just at the women, and you'll see for why that's the case. We're going to be only looking at women who are residing in these rural areas. And for those rural residents, female labor force non-participation, as you can see, has been actually increasing over time, despite the increase in GDP per capita. And there seems to be no let-up in this at all. There's no evidence that this is changing or declining or anything at all. In the right panel, what we have is female labor, secondary school enrollment rates. And what you see here is, in fact, that there's been actually convergence. And by 2020, which is the last year for which we have data, in fact, these have actually converged. And the usual story is that with an increase in female education, this is the Claudia Golden story, you're going to actually see an increase in female labor force participation. But certainly, at least in rural India, this is not the case. Okay, so this is kind of the motivation for the research. Now, a number of factors have been proposed to explain these empirical patterns. For example, people have talked about traditional gender norms, which can explain, for example, why female labor force participation is so low. And then we have stories like income effects of reduced employment opportunities in agriculture with economic development, which could explain possibly the change over time in female labor force participation. And what we're going to do in this research is to propose a potentially coexisting mechanism, social status, as an explanation for both the level as well as the change in female labor force non-participation. And it turns out that social status actually, we're not the first people to think about social status. This is actually the subject of a very long-standing literature in economics. So what does this literature say? So in this literature, social status is assumed to be increasing in relative wealth. And here I'm going to emphasize the word relative, as you will see. But wealth is unobserved, and so it has to be revealed. And there is a very famous quote from Veblen, going all the way back to 1899, which is often cited in these papers, the more recent papers on social status. And what Veblen says is that in order to gain the esteem of men, it is not sufficient merely to possess wealth or power. The wealth or power must be put in evidence, for esteem is awarded only on evidence. And what then Veblen goes on to say is that one way in which you can do this is through what he calls conspicuous consumption. You can signal your wealth by buying, a fancy car, or flashy jewelry, or something like that. Alternatively, he talks about conspicuous leisure or abstention from labor, which can also be used as a signal. And in our current context, this latter mechanism is obviously quite relevant because you could imagine that households or ethnic groups in developing economies could withdraw their women from the labor force as a way of visibly signaling a reduction in their income and thereby signaling their unobserved wealth. Okay, so that's kind of the idea that we have. Now, the first question you might ask is, well, okay, fine. So why are they doing this? What's the value of social status? Now, one obvious reason why you want social status is because you just like to be the big person in the room. It's just this esteem that comes with higher social status. But there is a literature going back to the 1990s, which actually argues that social status is valuable beyond such esteem because it provides preferred access to non-market goods and services. Okay, so this kind of brings us back to the sort of story about economic development, right? So think about it, an economy which is developing, where markets are going to be imperfect or incomplete. And you can imagine that status will be very especially important in such an environment where many goods and services are going to be allocated outside of the market mechanism. And this would explain why you might have high female labor force non-participation in developing countries. Now, in the long run, of course, with economic development, the markets will kick in, the markets will develop. And then if this is the story, then in the long run, the social status mechanism will become less relevant. And that's something which even Weber knows. But in the short run or in the medium run, the social status mechanism could actually result in an increase in labor force non-participation if the value of social status, if the value of these non-market goods is actually increasing with economic development, or if people are more willing to actually signal their wealth, perhaps because their own income has gone up, for example. Then you could actually see an increase in female labor force non-participation with economic development. So this is actually a kind of nice, kind of relatively simple, parsimonious explanation for what people have been observing in the data.
Which kind of goods should we think about?
What's that?
Which kind of goods?
I'll talk more about it. Things like the access to health services or education, things like that. Yeah.
I guess it sort of starts with the premise that women must all want to work inherently. So like you couldn't have leisure, especially female.
Yeah, we'll talk about leisure as well. No, of
Stay
course
at
we
home
talk about alternatives. Absolutely. So we'll talk about alternative explanations going forward as well. But the idea is that, what I just showed you, I didn't show you the numbers, but what you started off over there was that 40% of rural Indian women were not working in the late 1980s. By 2018, 80% of rural Indian women were not working. That's a very high number. So if you can talk about the value of leisure, et cetera, we'll talk about that a lot, obviously, as we go forward. But that number itself tells you something else is going on here. It's not what you would expect to observe. Yes?
Yeah, so you can differ this. Because when you think of the signaling mechanism, there could be many other ways to signal your wealth. right? Why would you choose this particular way of having the
We'll talk
women?
about that later
not-
on. So, but he talked about that. It could have conspicuous consumption, it could have something else.
You can have the
So
men
you-
retiring early, for instance, instead.
Absolutely. So this is going to be a focal point for a reason. So
Yeah.
we'll talk about that later on,
Okay.
right? Because there are going to be multiple equilibria, etc. We'll hold off on that if you don't.
Yeah.
So it's a clarification question. So you want us to think about social status is different than gender norms.
Absolutely.
Right.
There's a distinguish between the two. They're very closely related, getting back to Lakshmi's point, because I'm going to argue that the reason why they're using table labor force non-participation is because the traditional norm for higher caste women was actually to not work. And that's the gender norm. And so that serves as
That's
a
why it's a status.
it becomes, when the time comes later on in the economic development to play the status game between the low caste and the high caste, that's a natural sort of focal point to pick up. But you will see that they're otherwise fundamentally quite different. It's other ways which will allow us to distinguish between the two. But we don't want to say that it's just one versus the other, because in fact, this is really closely related. The inception of this particular behavior is really coming from these genders.
And then just the second question about the relative wealth thing. So this mechanism
Yeah.
is something that we only observe once there's increasing inequality.
Well, we'll talk about that. You guys are jumping too far.
Sorry, okay.
There's no point otherwise. I'll never get through anything. If you ask me in the first 5 minutes about the whole paper. At least let me say something, and then if you have a question, we can get to it. This is going to be one of the key things, is about the relative one. Exactly. Okay. Okay, so now let's talk about the second panel, which was about the education. And you might say, well, why is it that you see what we just saw? One explanation for this through the lens of a model of status is that when female education goes up, the household's potential income goes up, and as a result is willing to actually compete more for status. And so you could end up with this paradoxical result where an increase in female education could actually result in actually an increase in female labor force non-participation. And again, we'll flesh this out in much more detail later on, but this allows us to sort of reconcile those initial figures that we saw. Okay, now the question is, how do we actually go about doing this? Now, our ultimate objective is going to be to explain the dynamics of female labor force non-participation in India through the lens of a model with social status in it, right? But first, I need to convince you that, in fact, there is a link between female labor force non-participation and status. And to convince you that this is really the underlying mechanism what's driving it. And the challenge here, as with any research on social status, is that the benefits of status are not directly observed. And so what we're going to do, taking the lead from other studies that have also looked at status, not in developing countries, but more generally in the economics literature, is to derive conditions under which either the value of status or the willingness to signal this, your wealth is particularly high. And you'll show that female labor force non-participation is particularly high in precisely those conditions. Okay, and this is exactly the approach, by the way, that is taken in a recent paper at Atkin et al., which is published in the JPE, which uses the same core data set as we do, but there they focus on identity, and we focus on status. So in their analysis, they take status as endogenous and as exogenous, and they endogenize identity. We'll do the converse. We'll take caste identity as exogenous, and we'll endogenize the status. Now, why are we focusing on rural Indian women? It's because both sources of variation that we're going to use to establish the link between female labor force non-participation and status in the cross-section across Indian districts, as well as within districts over time, will only apply to rural populations. Okay, so it's really more of an issue about the identification of this relationship. And also, as you will see, our model really does apply more closely to a rural setting, where you will typically have in a village, one or two major castes who will be in some sense competing with each other. In an urban setting, there will be many castes from many different parts of the country. So it's probably a more complicated kind of model to think about as well as to test.
The trends are similar, right? In fact,
This I don't know, that's what I said, but we are really just focusing on the rural. But it's not to say that this mechanism would not apply to an urban
But you
area.
can't
We just don't know
identify
how
it.
to identify or to test that. That's the reason. At the same time, the last available census for India is from 2011. At that point in time, 70% of the Indian population was living in rural areas. So it's not like a small, it's not like the US or something, where if I said I was looking at rural populations, you might be like, what the hell is that about? Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about status in India. And as you might imagine, it's going to be related to the caste system. This is in some ways a society that's really well suited for an analysis of status. Now, the majority Hindu population, which accounts for, I think, about 80% of the population today or so, is vertically stratified into broad caste categories or varnas, within which are many endogamous castes or jatis. Now, if you want to study, for example, social networks in India, those will be typically organized at the level of the caste. And that's the kind of work that I've been doing for the last, 20, 25 years now. But if you want to study status, then it's really the vertical hierarchy, the varnas, that become relevant. And all of the data sets that we're going to be using in this paper will provide essentially for every household in the surveys that we're going to be looking at, they will tell you whether the household is scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, or something else. And the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribes are at the very bottom of the social hierarchy in Indian society. So we're going to designate the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe households as the low status households, and all the other households are going to be the high status households. Now, while this ranking could be maybe fixed, the high status house, the high caste households are always going to be above the low caste households, both in status as well as in income, by the way. The relative position of these groups could be changing over time. And this is really what we want to be understanding, as well as across space. So there's a very famous Indian sociologist, M.N. Srinivas, who describes a process of Sanskritization with economic development, in which the low caste attempt to raise their social position by adopting the behaviors that were traditionally adopted by the high caste. And the withdrawal of women from the labor force is one such behavior. And so that's what we're going to be, we look at other behaviors as well, but this is going to be, and therefore this is quite relevant, okay, to what we're going to be looking at. Okay. So now the question that someone was asking, I think was what do these low caste, what do they benefit by playing the status game with the high caste, which Srinivas talks about? Now remember here that the low caste, they face many types of discrimination, both in rural as well as in urban India. Okay, and to give you one example, the staff in local facilities, these could be health facilities, education facilities, government offices, whatever it is, they will be aware of an individual's caste from their name or their address. And this may be less relevant in an urban setting, but not completely irrelevant. But in a rural setting, I would say that is pretty much the case. That they will kind of know, if it's the local hospital or the local health center, they will kind of know from the person's name or from their address, because the address actually, in an Indian village, there's a main village and then there are colonies. And if your address is from one of the colonies, then they know that you are going to be scheduled caste or scheduled tribe. Now, the thing is that they will not have individual specific information about this, let's say the patient's wealth, or for that matter, any kind of household level signaling behavior, like whether this person's wife works or not. But what they will have is information at the group level about that particular person's caste, or the kinds of behaviors that this particular caste is associated with. Is it the case that this particular caste in this particular local area, for example, was once upon a time a low caste, and today the women, for example, tend not to work? And that will signal that this particular low caste is kind of has a relatively high standing in this particular society. And so the way that we're going to play this sort of model the status game is going to be at the group or the caste level. And I think that is a reasonable assumption, because in rural India in particular, your identity and your status are determined by your caste. Okay, so that's how we're going to be thinking about it.
What do you have in mind in terms of local facilities?
Okay, so what we have in mind, so I'll give you an example later on. We actually have some stuff we've done explicitly with health facilities. So in rural India, for example, you have, there's the health system, the initial point of contact is the primary health center, then you have community health centers, and then you have rural hospitals. And if you can't be treated in any of those facilities, then you're sent off to the district hospital, which is going to be in the urban part of the district. And the idea that we have is that these people, the people who work in these health facilities, they're not necessarily locals to a village or anything, but they are people who will know about, in the local area about these different groups. That's the kind of thing that we have. Okay, and this is quite important because there are many, if for anyone who's grown up in India, and I can see many faces that look like they might be South Asian, you will know how important status is, right? It's not just about the health facility. You go to a shop, for example, and the person with higher status is going to be treated more deferentially than the person with low status. So it's even in the sort of broader speaking, outside of public health systems and education systems, it's just something which is a part of daily life, and you will always have some benefit in some sense from that. That's what we have in mind. Okay, so let me now kind of take you through this very simple model of status, which kind of captures the idea that I've been describing for you in words. And here are the ingredients of the model. So the first thing is we're going to assume that wealth is not publicly observed. And so households have to signal their wealth by making costly choices. In the model, we will be agnostic about what that choice is. It will be just some cost seen. But in the empirical work, for most of it, we're going to be focusing on female labor force non-participation as one of the costs that the household is going to bear. And what you're going to see is that in equilibrium, wealthy households will end up with higher status. Okay, now why is it that we want that these households want higher status? And as I said earlier, it's because status basically gives you preferred access to these non-market goods and services, not because these households just value higher esteem in itself. Okay, and these instrumental concerns are going to arise, as I said, because markets are incomplete or function imperfectly in developing economies. Okay, now the status game could in principle be played between individuals or between groups. And as I said, we're going to think about it as a game between groups, which is also consistent, by the way, with Srinivasan's factorization of the status game or of Sanskritization. This is really a story about these different caste groups kind of moving themselves higher up in the, improving their social position. And he always thinks of it at the group level, and that's how we're going to model it. But the key thing here, which I emphasized earlier, and which gets to Taran's point about the wealth, is that ultimately status is inherently relative. And so it's a zero-sum game. If I have higher status, then you have to have lower status. We can't all increase our status. And so there have been recently, I think, a number of papers in the development literature which talk about status signaling. They use the word status in the paper, but they're really talking about signaling your wealth, for example. And my view would be that if you're signaling your wealth, that's fine. That's a one type of equilibrium that you have, but that's not necessarily a story about status. To model or to actually identify status, there must be a reference group. And that gets back to the point you're making. It has to be about the relative gap, the distance between these groups. That must enter into the model somehow. And that's going to be key to our identification of the status effect, as you will see.
So Kaivan,
Yeah.
If they don't care about status for its own sake, they only care about because you get these non-market goods and services, is one implication of your model that if
They could, that's not that they
this-
don't, but this is one of,
Yeah,
because
no,
I'm
I'm just trying to distinguish. So suppose if this market incompleteness was removed, the markets became more efficient in providing these goods and
Yeah,
services,
yeah.
you should see this competition sort of decline.
That would be my view, that in the long run, if you go to an advanced economy, for example, these things should be less relevant because we don't need to play the status game anymore. We're going to use the market to allocate.
Right.
Exactly. That's in the long run. But in the short to medium run,
Correct. The
even
question is
though
how
this
long does it
economy
take,
is
right?
developing, you could actually end up with a situation where these people are going to play the status game hard.
Right.
That's
That's what.
potentially the thing that could be driving this. And that's what we want to test, obviously. If that's
In some
exactly,
cases in India, at least the market has improved, like I think.
it has.
You know,
Yes.
in the olden days, getting a telephone was a marker of status. It was like, big deal. And now it's like, everybody has a cell phone.
So in the long run, I mean, of course, I'll be dead by then, but in the long run, I would say that you want to test this idea, you want to wait for another whatever many years and.
So I was thinking, when I asked the question about inequality, I was thinking about, as an economy moves from everyone being a farmer to now it's more, there's different choices, there's more inequality. And so this status game should emerge and there's nothing stopping it from going away unless what Lakshmi is saying is now the markets come in
That's
and
exactly right.
reduce the value.
Exactly
So
right.
you can have inequality still there.
Yes. But then it wouldn't matter because then you wouldn't
Yeah.
care to play the game. Exactly. Once you see the model, it'll become very clear to you what is going on over here. Okay. So this is a very simple model, as I said, but I think it captures quite nicely this sort of verbal description that I've just given you. So the status game is played by the local population in each village, which consists of two groups, an age group and an L group. Okay. And each of these groups has N households. Now, when we estimate the model later on, we will allow obviously low caste and high caste populations to be different. But for us, analytically, this is going to help us quite a bit. Okay. Now, since the game is going to be played at the group level, we're going to assume that all households within a group K have the same wealth or income endowment, YK, in a given village. Okay. However, these income endowments, they will vary across villages. And the levels in a given village are going to be private information. So in particular, the external agents, the people as Joe was asking, these external agents in the hospitals, for example, who are deciding who gets preferential treatment or not, those people do not actually observe YK directly. Okay, so that's why you need to actually signal your wealth. Now we're going to assume that YH is always greater than YL, which is kind of consistent with the data. The upper castes are still wealthier than the lower castes in India. I don't think that's ever, unless in some very unusual setting, but mostly that's always going to be the case. But the gap between the H and the L group, that could vary across groups. Okay, and that's going to basically be what we're going to be talking. Okay, so now households derive utility from the consumption of market goods and from a non-market good that is going to be allocated through the status mechanism. Status is increasing in wealth, but as we just said, this wealth is not going to be observed. So let's consider the wealth of household I in group K. That household is going to choose to signal its wealth, is going to make a costly choice, which is going to have value CIK. Okay, so as I said, in the model, we're kind of agnostic about what CIK is. Okay, in the empirical work, of course, CIK will map directly into the cost of actually withdrawing the woman from the labor force. But in principle, you could do other things, right? Like conspicuous consumption or whatever else you wanted to do. Okay, and what's the value of the status? The per capita or per household value of status is going to be P. And if I'm Lakshmi, this is what would go in the long run. We would go to zero, right? And then you would not want to.
Do you have savings like this household?
No. So it's just basically in every period you just have income and then you basically.
So like households could not like save a bit and then like use the savings.
This is not even a dynamic model, right? This is a static model. So it's just literally we're just looking at it at one point in time. So it's not a complete, very complicated model, right? It's just a one-off thing. You have income endowment, you decide how much to that to allocate. Okay, so we're going to assume that preferences over the consumption of the market goods are logarithmic, and we're going to normalize so that the price of the consumption bundle is going to be equal to 1. Okay, so now this is the utility that household I in group K gets from the consumption of the market good as well as from the consumption of the non-market good. So CK, this thing over here, wow, this is cool. That is the total cost of all the members of group K. Okay, and you can see here that this satisfies the budget constraint. So if the two groups both put in the same signaling cost, then every member is going to get exactly V. If group minus K puts in 0 cost, then every member of group K is going to get 2V. Okay, so that's kind of exactly what you would want to have. So that's kind of where that particular functional form comes from, okay, for the status function. Now, this particular setup is actually very similar to a model of conflict in Esteban and Ray. So this is the Esteban and Ray have written a bunch of papers on conflict, which some of you might be aware of. And they have a paper in the AER in 2011 where they actually model the intergroup conflict. And this setup is very similar to that, and there's a reason for that. At some level, status and conflict are not that different. There are different ways of allocating resources. I know it sounds crazy. I mean, this is a kind of crazy economist way of thinking, but it's a way of allocating resources outside of the market. With conflict, you actually investing, and then you have this in whatever, the expenditures on weaponry, etc. And then you have this, this violent whatever outcome that comes, the fight that comes with it. Status can be thought of as, in some sense, a non-violent conflict, where you're sort of investing in this signaling as a way of determining your share of the resources. Okay, but they make the same assumption as we do, by the way, which is that each individual or each household chooses its signal CIK, taking the signals of other households in its group, as well as the signals of the other households in the other group as given. So we're going to be solving for the Nash equilibrium, but the allocation itself, this is where the group, thing comes in. The allocation is determined by the aggregate contributions of all members of the group. So we're assuming that everybody in some sense is independent and self-interested, but the numbers are small enough that it will still matter in terms of your choices. Okay, is this clear to all of you, the setup here? Okay, good. So now you're going to, the household I is going to choose its wealth signal to maximize its utility, as I said, taking the signals of all other households as given. And so we can solve out for these, and since this is a symmetric equilibrium, so at the end, when we get the first order condition, we can set CIK to be the same for all members of group K, and similarly for the members of group minus K, and you end up with equation 2, which is the first order condition. So you have basically 2 equations now and 2 unknowns, CK and C minus K, or CH and CL, right? So the first thing you can see from this is that if you divide one of those equations by the other, you'll end up with equation 3. Okay, what is this saying? This is basically saying that both groups will expend the same share of their income endowment on signaling and equilibrium. Okay, and so what this is telling us is that in fact the non-market good would have been allocated in exactly the same way if these external agents could actually observe the income. So instead of having the sum of the C's, if you have the sum of the Y's, you'd have ended up with exactly the same allocation. The problem is that now, because you cannot observe the Y's, it's private information, these guys have to actually put in these costly and inefficient signals. Okay, that's the first observation from this. The second observation is you can notice here that the consumption signals are actually strategic complements. And so one thing that you could do to test for the status game would be to say that if CIK was exogenously increased, then CK would increase as well. But for that, you would need to find an instrument for C minus K, right? And that's not easy to find. There's actually a recent paper in the AER, which looks at education choices in Korea and status, associated with that, where they do actually try to find an instrument for the education, choices of the other group. But what we do instead to actually test for status is to just take an approach which is also followed by these other previous papers, the Charles et al., Burstein, Atkin et al., where we actually derive the signaling cost as a function of the primitive variables in our model, which is V, VH, and YH and YM.
Yeah, I was in fact going to suggest sending your kid to study abroad as another marker of status.
Yes, no. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these plug in from equation 3 and equation 2. And then what you're going to end up with is basically this result over here. We're going to get equation 4. Okay? This is very simple. It's just two equations, two unknowns. We can get this, right? And what this does is it allows us then to derive the following result, which is that the average signaling cost in a local population is increasing in V, is increasing in the mean income endowment, which we're going to denote by V bar, and it's increasing and is decreasing in the income endowment gap between the groups, which is what we're going to call delta Y. Okay. Now, to derive this result, what we have to do is to look at equation 4 and then just take the average over the two groups. And you're going to end up with equation 5, which is C bar D is equal to Y bar divided by 1 plus KW. And the trick over here is that you look at K. This K function is this nonlinear function. And so therefore, even as simple as the model is, it creates some complication as a result of that. But the trick here is to write the K function, instead of being a function of YL and YH, you write it down as a function of Y bar and delta Y. And that is what you have over here. Where delta Y is the income endowment gap between the two groups. And now you can see very easily what's going to happen. Go back to this equation over here first. Let's start off first with equation 5. As V goes up, remember W is right over here. W and V are inversely related. So as V goes up, W goes down, and therefore C bar goes up. That's pretty obvious, right? So if the value of status goes up, you're going to invest more in the signaling. What about Y bar? So Y bar is a bit more complicated because Y bar is over here, and it's also in the K function. And in the K function, it's in the numerator as well as the denominator. But you can actually show that K is actually unambiguously decreasing in Y bar. If you differentiate. And so now what that implies is that as Y bar goes up, K goes down, and Y bar is over here as well. And therefore, as Y bar goes up, C bar goes up. What's the intuition for that? This is coming from diminishing marginal utility of consumption of the market. As your income goes up, you're going to be willing to pull out more to spend on the status game. So in some sense, this is quite obvious. And as you will see, you could think about alternate explanations for that result based on a story about income effects. As your income, and that's what Lakshmi was talking about as well, as your income goes up, it's not in our model, but the female might then want to have more leisure, for example. So the implication that's most useful for us in this particular context is the one with respect to delta Y. So look at this over here. So what happens to delta Y? So as delta Y increases, K is going to be increasing as well. So now you go back and see what happens here. As delta Y increases, K increases, and therefore C bar goes down. And so what's the intuition for this? The intuition for this negative correlation is that basically, remember here, the status signals are strategic complements. So they're basically mutually reinforcing. So when the two groups are very far apart, which is what would have been the case prior to economic development, then the low group is not going to try to push up at all. It's just too far away. But as they come closer together, it's a bit like an arms race. Then because of the mutually reinforcing nature of these strategic complements, they're going to start to compete more. And so as the gap between these two groups closes, that's what the model tells us, C bar is going to increase.
And is it critical to assume for this later result that you have that the two goods are like imperfect substitutes?
The two groups are not imperfect.
No, the two goods, like
The two goods.
Yes.
Uh,
Or is it not important?
Market and the non.
No, I don't think it really matters, not really, no. No. I don't think so, I don't.
No, because it could be that, like, for example, if the relative price of non-market goods increases relative to the other, like you want to substitute
But
non-market.
this is already built into this, right? I mean, there's a certain, utility that you get from that. I mean, that's basically all it is. It's just a trade-off between these two. So
So the elasticity of substitution between those two goods doesn't play a role for your result.
I don't think, I mean, we are just trying to get some intuition from this about these trade-offs, right? Okay. So now let's do one more corollary to this, which has to do to separate out by the two groups. And you'll see why this is actually quite interesting as well. So this is a very simple model, but you're going to see that it actually generates some very sharp predictions. So when you separate out for the two groups, nothing changes in the denominator. It's still 1 plus KW because that hasn't changed. But the numerator now, remember, CL for CL, you would have YL in the numerator. And what is YL? YL is just Y bar minus delta Y. And for CH, it would be Y bar plus delta Y. So now this has no effect at all for the implications for V and Y bar. Those two things are going to basically follow in exactly the same way. That hasn't changed. The big change has to do with the delta Y term because now you've got these delta Y terms in the numerator as well. And remember here that when you're looking at the effect on C bar, there was a negative correlation. As delta Y goes down, you're going to have an increase in C bar. And that's coming through this K function in the denominator. Now, if you look at the low group CL, there's this other term now in the numerator, which is going to reinforce that because you have minus delta Y. So the effect of the negative effect of delta Y on the signaling cost is going to be increased or amplified for the low group, and it's going to be dampened for the high group. And in particular for the high group, if this delta Y term in the numerator has a sufficiently large effect, you may not even get a negative relationship between CH and delta Y. But for sure, what you're going to find is that this relationship is true. The magnitude of the effect, the absolute magnitude of the effect, will be larger for the low group than the high group because of the delta Y in the numerator. Okay, so what the model tells us, a very simple model, is that as Y bar increases, and if you make some assumptions here, you can also see that these effects will be approximately the same. So as Y bar increases, holding constant the income gap between the two groups, you're going to see a roughly similar increase in magnitude for the low group and the high group. But as delta Y increases, the effect is going to be stronger for the low group than for the high group, with the average being somewhere in the middle. Okay, just keep that in your mind. And now let's go to the data and actually test this. Okay. Yeah.
It seems like the results of this model all have to be driven by the shape of this like allocation function, right? Like how much V you get depends on the share that your group has invested of the total, as opposed to like, I don't know, a different shaped function. Is there a reason to believe that?
Because this just seemed like an easy kind of linear kind of approach. It's exactly what Esteban and Ray do. And one test of this is I just derived some very sharp predictions from this model, which you tell me are driven by the functional form, right? So let us see whether they line up. And if they do line up, then it's your job to find another functional form which would give you the same thing, which doesn't have a status model in it. That's not my job. I mean, I'm writing down a model for you and testing. Otherwise, there's no end to it, right? I mean, how can I ever, do anything? I can never derive predictions which have some bite unless I'm willing to put some structure on the model. There's no way. If I write down a completely general model, then I can never get such sharp predictions. That's just the nature of, the trade-off that we have to make. So that's just, what it is. Okay, so this is what we're going to do now. Now we're going to take a linear approximation. That's a nonlinear model. We're going to take a linear approximation to actually test these predictions. On the left-hand side, you're going to have the signaling cost, which we're not going to measure by the female labor force non-participation. But there's one little twist here, which will not be the case when we actually estimate the model, which is that we're going to ignore the fact that that should be in principle multiplied by the female wage, because it's the monetary cost of pulling route. We're going to just measure on in this particular part, when we're testing the model, we're going to just put in the female labor force non-participation itself. not multiplied by the wage, as you will see, because then our instruments are going to actually not be valid, be multiplied. On the right-hand side, what you're going to have is the y bar and the delta y, which I'm going to show you how we're going to construct them. And you, based on the model, the beta 1 should be positive and the beta 2 should be negative. And then we have district fixed effects. So this is going to be data using the National Sample Survey. So let me tell you a little bit about that. So this is something which many of you might be familiar with. So this is nationally representative data, which has been collected from rural and Indian households at different points in time. So we have 8 rounds between 1987 and 2011. And since we're interested in looking at changes over time within these districts, we're going to be using all the rounds for the benchmark specification. Okay, and in each of those rounds, in every district, we're going to construct y bar and delta y. We're going to put in district fixed effects. We're going to put in round dummies as well. And the idea is to try and capture as best as we can this sort of V function, which is also in the model. But you might think that V could be a little bit more, changing, for example, within districts over time. So we also play around with more flexible specifications to deal with that, which I won't talk about right now, but that's basically what we're going to be doing. Okay, so what we want to look at are these coefficients. Now, before we do that, we need to ask ourselves, how do you actually map the model to the data that we get from the National Sample Surveys? And so for those of you who are, the macro type people in the audience, we're going to make this sort of usual assumption that each representative household in a caste in a given district and time period consists of 2 individuals, a male and a female, and each of them have 1 unit of time. And so in our mod, and so basically the male is allocating all of his time to the job market and gets the market wage. And the female is going to basically allocate some share of her time to the job market and remain out of the market for the rest of the time. And that's going to determine this cost of, withdrawing her from the market. Okay, now you're going to have employment lotteries at the household level, which are going to basically generate discrete outcomes at the household level. Because obviously in our data, we don't observe a woman working for 24% of her time or 50% of her time. So you're going to have these employment sort of lotteries, as in this old paper a very famous paper by Rogerson. And so what that means is that the average female labor force non-participation in a district will correspond to the choice at the intensive margin within our model about how much of that 1 unit of time to allocate. Okay, that's the way you want to think about this. Okay, so now how do we actually construct the y bar and the delta y? So the y bar, remember, is the mean income endowment. And this is based on the potential income. Now, of course, in the data, there'll be many women who are not working, but you want to include them as well. So this is based on the shares of men and women and the shares of different castes who are of working age in the population, not based on the women who are actually working, right? The wages themselves are obviously going to be endogenous. We'll talk about the endogeneity in a second. But basically, this is how you construct y bar. So XKG is basically the share of males and females. So K is caste, G is gender. And so within a caste, XKM plus XKF is going to sum up to 1. So you have an equal, you have but they of course have different shares. You have a different number of working age men and working age women. If they were equal numbers, then you could just do the unweighted average. And XK is a fraction of households of each caste, high caste versus low caste, in this particular district at a particular point in time. So I'm not putting in district and time subscripts here, just to make life simple, but this is all being done in each district in each time period. We have hundreds of districts in each round, and we have 8 rounds, okay, just to be clear. And this is how we're constructing y bar, and the delta y is just the difference in the potential income between the high caste and the low caste. So now let's talk about the bias.
At a given point in time. Yeah.
At a given point in time. So this is in each round. So I'm not putting in the round and the district subscripts.
Yeah.
But this applies to a given district, a given round.
Okay.
Exactly. So these things are all changing over districts and over rounds.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now let's talk about the bias in the wages. Okay, there's basically 3 sources of bias in the wages. The first is reverse causality. As female labor force non-participation goes up, that's going to obviously affect the female wages themselves. Either because there's kind of some sort of selection by ability, or because you have the standard neoclassical production function, whichever way you want to think about it, there's going to be this reversing. In addition, if you look back at this estimating equation of ours, there's this epsilon over there, right? So this epsilon is basically any unobserved supply side effect. So you can think about, for example, gender norms or for example, the fraction of women who have to take care of children in their households, who are therefore not able to enter the labor force. If it's something that is constant over time, then it's going to get picked up by the district fixed effects. But if it's something that is changing within the district over time, that's going to go in the epsilon. And we need to worry about the possible correlation between epsilon and y bar and delta y, right? So that's your, yes, Joe?
Yeah, I just suggest a test that would test an alternative hypothesis that I think in your equation, you wouldn't be able to necessarily preclude, which is imagine that there's a threshold above which any household female labor force participation drops to zero. And
Is the threshold income or above? What is it above?
income, above which, a threshold above which female labor force, women aren't working, women don't work, okay? Then I think you would get you could get the same result, just that it's capped, you know, so like I can't have, if I'm really rich, I can't have 2 women not working in my house, you know what I'm saying? So, anytime something's bounded, then that gap could just be proxying for the fraction of the population that's above some threshold.
But this gap is gap between the.
No, not this one. I mean, the previous slide.
This previous one.
Where's your estimated equation with your beta 1 and beta 2? Is that the next one?
Back one more, I think. Yeah.
This one. If what really matters is the fraction of households that are above a certain level. Maybe that's even a stochastic problem. And I think you would still get beta 1 being bigger than 0 and beta 2 being less than 0.
But what is beta 2? The beta 2 is the income gap between the 2 caste groups.
Yeah.
Can we talk about this later? Because I have no idea what you're talking about. So if that would help. I mean, honestly, I just have no
Yeah, no, that's right.
sense of
I
what
don't want
where
to
you're
waste your
coming
time.
from.
Yeah, that's fine.
We should talk about it later because I really didn't, I'm not even sure what. Okay, so let me get back to this. These are the two potential sources of bias. And then the third one is measurement error. So in the model, and this gets back to this question about savings, etc. In the model, it's a static model. Right? There's a one point in time you're deciding, you have an income endowment, you decide how much you want to pull your women out of the labor force at that particular point in time. Now the NSS data, it gives you again wages at one point in time. So let us say that you have the 1987 round, you have wages in 1987, and you know whether this woman is working or not. But you can imagine that that decision is not going to be based on her wages in 1987 or her potential income in 1987. It's going to depend on the potential income of, let's say, of that household, perhaps over a period of time, like the recent history of income for that household, well, let's say the last 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, whatever it is, there's going to be some range of time, right? So what you're ultimately missing here when you construct the income in this way is there's going to be basically these lag wages in some sense, which should be in there, but which are not there. So this is non-classical measurement error, but you need to still worry about the fact that you're not correctly measuring your potential income because you're ignoring the lagged wages. So the instrument that we're going to use to deal with all of these sources of bias is basically going to be income shocks, rainfall shocks. And so the standard approach, this gets back to the standard ideas. If you want to estimate, for example, the labor supply response to a change in wages, what do you do there? The classical approach is you want to get some demand shocks, some labor demand shocks, right? And we want to do the same thing over here, because ultimately, in some sense, we're estimating something like a labor supply function. And the unobserved variables here, those epsilons, are all associated with the unobserved factors that determine labor supply. And the reverse causality, etc., all of these things are going to be basically associated with the labor supply. So what you want is an instrument which shifts the demand for labor. And in an agrarian economy, one obvious instrument which many people have used, by the way, is rainfall. Rainfall is going to determine the demand for labor, and through that is going to determine the wages. But in this particular case, what we really want are the rainfall shocks, because those rainfall shocks are going to be serially uncorrelated. So they will be uncorrelated with the measurement error as well, which consists of the lag wages. Okay, so this deals with all of these things. But the problem, of course, is that in an agrarian economy, rainfall will affect wages, but it's not going to affect wages in all sectors in exactly the same way. It'll affect non-agricultural occupations as well through some kind of general equilibrium effect, but not necessarily in the same way. So what we do is we first of all non-parametrically estimate the relationship between wages and rainfall shocks at the caste, gender, primary household occupation level, including district and round effects in the estimating equation. Once we've done that, we get a predicted wage. And we use that instead of the actual wage to construct our instruments for Y bar and delta Y. But when we do that, we also deal with these population shifts, which, as we said earlier, are going to be varying across districts and over time. And we do that in two ways. Either we take the average over all the rounds for a given district, which is what we do in the benchmark specification, or we take the average across all districts in a given round. And we get basically the same kind, and when we do that, the only thing to worry about then is that there is this average effect on the female labor force supply, but that will be picked up by the district fixed effects and by the round. So these instruments actually are quite good because we're using an exogenous source of variation, and it's going to be satisfying, I think, the explosion restriction, right? So
Just a data question. By wages, you mean earnings, right? Because there's a.
yeah, so the problem here is that you only observe this for a subsample of women, right? And even for men for that matter, because if you're a cultivator,
There's a
then you don't observe it for,
self-employment, yeah.
it's only some people are self-employed or not. So the implicit assumption here is that essentially you can transition from self-cultivation, for example, to the
Wage
labor
labor. So
market.
you're
that
estimating
becomes
from the
around,
sample of wage labor.
what's it?
You're estimating from the sample of wage laborers.
Yeah, there's no other choice. And that's another reason to also
I just
find
wanted to
instruments, right?
confirm
For
it,
this
yeah.
reason.
Yeah.
For all of these reasons, right? So the thing is, when we do it that way, then of course the estimating equation is very simple, and this is what you get. And the key thing I want to emphasize here is that it's not just the signs of the coefficients. If you remember, I also said that what you would want to observe is that the Y bar coefficient should be roughly the same for the low caste and the high caste. So go focus on the OLS and the IV are roughly the same. Okay, so we can focus on the IV because that does it correctly in some sense. And if you look at the first row, column 4, 5, and 6, you can see that the coefficient on the Y bar is roughly the same. It's not that far off. It's not that far off. But if you look at the coefficient on delta Y, which is in the second row, it is negative as you would expect. But notice that the absolute magnitude of that coefficient is largest for the low caste, is intermediate for the C bar, for the two groups together, and then it's lowest for the high caste, which is precisely again what this gets back to your point. So we have a model, we have a particular functional form, and then we test the predictions of that model. And this is what we get. Now, perhaps there is some other, and I think Joe was getting at that, maybe there's some other non-status model that would give you the same patterns. And that's what we need to think about. Is there something else that could do the same thing for you? So I should also mention, by the way, just in terms of research honesty, that we wrote this model long before we actually did these tests. And I actually didn't even think that we could do this until I realized that, hang on a second, we could use these rainfall shocks as instruments. And so we implemented this, much later, and it's sort of nice to see that you get results that are quite consistent. Okay, I'm going to move on because we're really far behind on time. But we can talk about alternative explanations, but without getting into too much. Basically, with these instruments, you can essentially rule out most supply side stories. If you think about changes, for example, in female education, gender norms, fertility of women, et cetera, those are going to be uncorrelated with these high frequency rainfall shocks. I think that's not a problem. The one thing that you might really need to worry about, I don't know whether that was really ultimately what Joe was getting at, is an alternative model with income effects. So if you imagine that there is an effect of income, this is the usual trade-off between income and leisure, right? Which is not part of our model. So you can imagine that as income goes up, you're going to see female labor force non-participation going up because of an income effect. And if you allow those income effects to vary by caste, for example, then you could in principle explain the result with C bar, the average, as the dependent variable. But if you have just each caste on its own, CL and CH on its own, then there's a very important difference between our model and the alternative model, which is that the cross-caste effects in our model should be significant. Because ours is the status model. So if I have CL over here, if I rewrite my model in terms of YH and YL, which I can easily do, then this is not going to be zero. But in the alternative model with income effects, then the cross-caste effects should be zero. And you can easily reject what is implied by our model based on our estimates.
But in your model, didn't it imply that the beta two should also be the same across?
No, in fact, what I say about beta 2 should have a larger magnitude for the low CAS and the smallest magnitude for the high CAS. And that's exactly what you see.
Okay,
It should be the same for the beta 1.
I see. Beta one should be the same.
Exactly. And that's quite a strong test, right? I mean, you're not just looking at the signs, you're looking at the magnitudes as well. And you're saying, hey, now this is where I'm going to now switch to the second section of the paper. And we're going to talk now about the cross-sectional variation in the social status. Okay, and why do we need to do this? There's two reasons to do that. The first is that in our model, remember, you have y bar, you have delta y, and you have v as well, the value of status. And I would like to test whether as the value of status goes up, based on whatever measure we come up with, you're actually going to see an increase in female labor force non-participation. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is when we actually estimate the structural model, we're going to need some source of variation in the v. So we need to find some variable that actually is going to move it around, right? And so that's the second reason to actually do it. So the measure that we're going to propose is basically based on the following argument, okay? Which is that the size of a local economy at early stages of economic development will be determined by agricultural productivity, which in turn can be measured by the population density. So this is this old Malthusian argument that those places which had higher productivity historically, prior to economic development, would have had higher population densities. Now, the second part of the argument is that in those places which have higher population densities, which have greater agricultural productivity, there's greater output, and therefore you would expect to observe that these local facilities are going to provide amenities of higher quality as well. So the hospitals, for example, will be of higher quality. And we actually have an appendix in the paper where we actually verify this with an example, as I said, from the Indian public health system, where we look at the actual, using data from the census and the IHDS, we can actually look at the size of local health facilities, as well as the services that they provide. And what we can show is that, in fact, in these more densely populated districts, each type of facility is larger and it provides more services. But at the same time, there's more competition for these facilities. The number of facilities, as well as the number of doctors per capita, is decreasing in population density. So if you're living in a more densely populated district, you will have access to better facilities. It's a bit like New York. If you're living in New York, you'll get access to really good hospitals, but you're going to have a hard time getting your foot in the door in those hospitals. Whereas if you live in New Haven, the hospital may not be as good, but there's much less traffic in some sense, right? That's kind of the trade-off that we have in mind. So this is the case, then what this implies is that both the low cost and the high cost should be actually investing more in the status gain in places which are more densely populated and which in addition have greater agricultural productivity. Okay, so now how do we actually measure agricultural productivity? Because this is a variable that varies across crops. Now the FAO GAZE database, it actually provides you with information on 42 crops. And you actually have the productivity for each of those crops. So what we're doing here is in sense using the potential yields of these crops as instruments for the population density. So whenever I show you something now with population density, it's either going to be instrumented by these potential crop yields or it's going to be the predicted population density. Okay, we're always going to be doing that. And this is what you see, which I think is kind of interesting in itself, by the way. So we're using the same data on the left-hand side, okay? This is still female labor force non-participation across these Indian districts. There are 8 rounds from 1987 to 2011. And on the x-axis, what you have is a log of population density in 1951, which is as far back as we can go. So this is when the Indian economy was just starting to develop after centuries of stagnation. And we're using that population density as a sort of static measure of agricultural productivity. We're always instrumenting, by the way, with these potential crop yields. Going forward in time. Okay, and so the first thing you see is that in 1987, there is a very steep increase in female labor force non-participation with respect to population density. And this variation is quite dramatic. It goes from 40% to over 70% across these Indian districts. By the time we get to 2011, it's become much flatter. But notice that for every level of population density, it's actually shifted up over time. Okay, we're not explaining the change over time at the moment, but what you're seeing is clearly that in both of the rounds, there is this positive association. If you look at the men in contrast, there's actually no association at all. Okay, all right. Now let's do the same thing in a regression table. Now, what we're doing here is we're just pulling all the 8 rounds together. And now we can do this separately for the low caste and the high caste, as we did in that previous regression table, or for all of the castes together. And what we're going to put on the right-hand side is population density and a time trend, where the time variable is where we subtract 1987 from the time variable, so that the population density coefficient there corresponds to the slope that I showed you in that figure in 1987. And we saw there that it was very steep and significant in 1987. That's also true for the high caste and the low caste. Okay, and if you look at the interaction, it's negative and significant, which is again consistent with what we saw in that figure. The slope is getting flatter. But if you look at the men, there's nothing at all. Okay, so this is kind of consistent with this idea that we have that in a world in which status is relevant, more agriculturally productive places which have higher population densities, that's where the value of status is greater, and that is where these women are going to be pulled out because of the status mechanism. But of course, I need to convince you that this is really the case, and I'm going to do that in a couple of ways as we go forward. But I should just mention one thing, that in the model, remember, it's not just we, it's also y bar and delta y. So these are unconditional associations, but we can include y bar and delta y in the regression, and you don't change anything. I just want to tell you.
Can you go back to that result? I just wanted to see.
Which, the figure or the table?
No, the table.
So for the men, there's nothing. For the women, you see the patterns that we would. And I just want you to see this because I'm going to show you another set of outcomes now, and you're going to see the same set of patterns.
It looks like the gap between the high caste and the low caste is going down all the time. Both groups are going up. I'm just curious. It's
Honestly, I don't know. I've not looked at that.
Yeah, I don't know what that your model would say about it. I'm just curious to know what happens. At least my rough idea from
The model would not say anything about it.
exactly your model may not say. I'm just curious to know just the facts.
Yeah.
It looks like the non-participation gap between the two is actually going down.
Yeah, you see that because, well, not quite, right? Because you would want, because it's getting flatter, more flatter for
The high caste is getting more flat than the.
So that looks a bit like at least it could be something,
Yeah.
but it's not something that we.
No, it's not from the model. I was just curious to know.
Yeah. Okay. Now that we have that, because you guys are quite quiet now, maybe I just kind of talk too much or whatever it is, but I personally this is the weakest part in some sense of the paper because we have this cross-sectional sort of variation, right? We don't have an instrument here. And so I'm telling you a story that, where there's greater productivity, you're going to have a greater, there's greater value from this social status, but you may or may not believe that. So what we would like to do is to do something more than that. Yeah.
I just think that you have the structural transformation thing that could be potentially confounding that.
Precisely. There are many other explanations that could be confounding this. We'll talk about autonomous explanations in a bit, but before I get to the autonomous explanations, because as you came up, it's so easy to come up with autonomous explanations with what I've just shown you, I would like to show you a couple more results to support this idea that there really is a status story going on over here. And one way to do that is to look at other behaviors that are also associated with status in India. And so again, if you look at Srinivas, again, he's talked a lot about status. And what he says is that status-seeking groups, they don't just withdraw their women from the labor force, they make other choices as well, which happen to again be associated with these traditional upper caste behaviors. And two of these are vegetarianism and teetotalism. So historically, the upper caste were vegetarian and they did not drink alcohol. But for the lower caste, this was not really a taboo. And what Srinivas describes is a story in which as these lower castes start to basically try to raise their social status, they start to adopt, they don't just withdraw their women from the labor force, they also start to adopt these other customs as well. So if this is a story about status, then we should also observe the same association between population density and alcoholism and vegetarianism. Okay, and so this is what we're going to do next. And if you look at these coefficients for both vegetarianism and teetotalism, you're going to see that they look exactly the same as what I showed you earlier for female labor force non-participation. More densely populated districts, households there are more likely to be vegetarian, and they're also more likely to be abstaining from alcohol, as well as we saw, withdrawing their women from the labor market. Okay, another way to look at this would be to just look directly at the correlation between these different outcomes. And that's what you see over here. So both for the low caste and the high caste, As female labor force non-participation goes up, you see that there's also an increase in vegetarianism as well as in teetotalism. And these are variables that have also been associated, as I said, with status by Indian sociologists. Okay, so this is giving you some more sort of, sense that maybe there's really a status story here and not something else.
This is a cross-sectional correlation. This is not over time, right? It's just.
This is just across all rounds or whatever it is, exactly. Okay, so another way that we can do this is to look at female labor force non-participation across regions. And here this will get back to what Lakshmi was talking about earlier, about why we chose, for example, female labor force non-participation as a particular, why did they choose female labor force non-participation? And the first thing to note is that if you want to play the status game, there has to be some kind of stratification in a society. There has to be there has to be a hierarchy. And in addition, there has to be this hierarchy that's been around for a while, like in India, for example, because then there will be particular behaviors that were traditionally associated with these higher status groups, which the lower status groups can then, can also adopt as a way of raising their position. So India, of course, is a good example where you have this very, highly stratified societies. But is this true in other parts of the world? And there is a very old idea in the social sciences. This is not just in economics. This actually goes back to Adam Smith. But then you have anthropologists like Kantian or evolutionary biologists like Jared Diamond, who have always argued that basically what you need for a stratified society is greater agricultural productivity. And the idea is that when you have greater productivity, there is this surplus. And as a result, there are these elites who then are going to go and extract this. Okay, and so this is a very long-held view, by the way, as I said, in the social sciences. It turns out that view is actually incorrect. So there's a recent paper in the JPE, just a couple of years ago, by Shah et al., who showed that it is not agricultural productivity, but actually the type of crop that determines whether or not you're going to have this kind of vertical stratification with the emergence of elites. And the point that they make is that if you're growing cereals, which are storable, then of course there can be an elite that will emerge to extract and appropriate those cereals. But if you're going to be growing crops that are perishable, then of course you cannot do that. And they do not emphasize the difference between Asia and Africa. But they have a figure in their paper where they look at across the world. And what you see is really striking is that in Asia, almost all the cultivation, in fact, all the cultivation is of cereals. In Africa, people grow roots and tubers in abundance. So based on this story, you might expect that Asian societies are going to be much more vertically stratified than African societies. And there's a very famous anthropologist, Goody, who did a lot of work in the 1970s on differences between Asian and African societies. And the point that he makes is that status group endogamy is a prerequisite for a vertically stratified society. It must be that high status women marry high status men, for example. And the point that he makes is that you do not observe this in Africa. You observe this in Asia, but not in Africa. So if we think that that vertical stratification is a prerequisite for people to play the status game, then if that is true, we would expect to observe this positive association between female labor force non-participation and population density in Asia, but not in Africa. So let's look at the data to see what we get. So on the left panel, you have cross-country data from the ILO. And the red circles are countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and the black squares are countries in South and Southeast Asia. And what you see is that in African countries, across African countries, there's essentially no association at all. If anything is slightly negative. Whereas across Asian countries, there is this very steep and positive association, which is kind of what we saw across these Indian districts as well. Now, this, of course, is cross-country data. And you might say, hey, what's the point of cross-country data, right? So what we do in panel B is to go to the DHS, because with the DHS, you can actually go down to the district level, as we do with the Indian data. And you have 8 Asian countries in the DHS, and I think it's something like 22 African countries or something. So there's lots of data. Now there's much more overlap in the population densities because we're using district level data. But the key result remains. If you look at the African districts, there's no association between population density and female labor force participation. If you look at the Asian districts outside of India, you get this positive association. And if you look at India, it's way up, by the way. So this is not the gender norms or something else that's going on as well at the same time. But India is also increasing the same way. And if you ran a regression, the coefficient for India and the rest of Asia would be very similar. We have it in the paper. But for Africa, there's nothing there at all. So again, you might say, hey, there are other reasons for why you might see these differences between Asia and Africa. But I just want to show you with data from Indian districts with the female labor force non-participation, with data from Indian districts with the vegetarianism and teetotalism, and then with data across Asia and Africa, you get very consistent patterns that align up with a story based on the social status. But of course, with this kind of thing, you really have to worry about the alternative explanations. Okay, this is like, I don't have an instrument. I'm just telling you a story, and I've tried to give you some evidence, but you might worry. And so what we do in the paper is to think systematically about the alternative explanations. The most obvious one is just an income effect. It could be that these more densely populated districts, they have higher productivity, they just have higher incomes, and therefore they're withdrawing their women from the labor force. Now here, I think the cleanest way to deal with this is to look at the men. If it was really a story about income effects, it's possible that if female wages are relatively low and women can do home production more than men can, that there will be a stronger relationship between income and withdrawal from the labor market for them than for the men. But you should still see an effect for the men. Whereas with the status story, there's no reason for the men to withdraw if in fact what we're doing is to hone in on this traditional behavior, which is female labor force non-participation. That's the focal point in the status game. So that would be one way of thinking about this. By the way, I didn't show this to you, but if you look up in the last set of results between Asia and Africa, you get the same result there as well. For the men, there's no difference at all. Okay, so it's just for the women that you see this particular pattern. The second thing could be the demand for female labor. So this is again a very old story that goes back to this famous anthropologist Esther Boserup. People have looked at this in India as well. And then Joe was talking about structural transformation. So it could be, for example, that the demand for female labor, either in agriculture or in non-agricultural occupations which emerge with the onset of economic development, just happens to be lower for women in these more densely populated districts, for example. So there is a gap between the supply and the demand for female labor. But if that is true, then the wages of the women in these more densely populated districts should be lower as well. But what we get is exactly the reverse. Wages are actually higher for women in the densely populated districts. Okay, then there's female labor supply. So this is again something that Tarun has been thinking about a lot. So you have, this is the Afridi et al. Paper, which is, you don't see Tarun here, but she's part of this, part of the co-authors. So the story here is that, people have talked about, Gordon talks about this, about how with the increase in female education, women are going to enter the labor force. So the story here would be perhaps that for whatever reason, education is actually lower in these densely populated districts. And you actually don't see that either. It's actually higher. And then it could be marriage and fertility rates. It could be that, for example, you have higher fertility in these places. So these women are at home because they need to take care of the kids. We see no evidence that fertility rates or marriage rates vary with population density. And so this brings us to the final story about the gender norms, which someone brought up at the very beginning. So the first question is, what are these gender norms? So this is a word that people use at this point in time very, very loosely in the literature. Everyone is talking about gender norms. What are gender norms and what do they mean? So there is, of course, a much older literature, by the way, outside of economics, which has thought about these gender norms. And the story here is that basically this has to do with women's status, not social status. And the idea is that these women actually would like to work, but they are held back by the men from actually entering the labor force. Okay, so this is a story about their low status within their households, which keeps them at home. Okay, now if you had a story where, for example, the gender norms were stronger for whatever reason in the more densely populated districts, then that would give you the results that I've shown you as well, independently of a status story. And I want to emphasize that that gender norms in our model are quite closely related in the sense that the reason why we focus on female labor force non-participation in the status game is because the gender norm historically was that upper caste women did not work. That was the starting point. So both our model and the gender norms model have a common point of departure. But the difference is that with economic development, you would expect these gender norms to weaken over time, not strengthen over time. That's typically the pattern that you would expect with these kinds of traditional norms. Whereas then with our model, there are reasons why it might actually be increasing over time, as we've discussed in the model, right? Now, how would you distinguish between them in the cross-section? Because this is where we are right now. And one way to do that is to actually look at measures of the woman's status itself. And one way to do that, for example, would be to say, hey, you know, the DHS and the IHDS, which are both nationally representative surveys, they both have information about women's autonomy as well as their decision-making power. Does this vary with population density? And we find that it does not. Okay, so that's kind of, again, now you might say that, well, but you know, they just have 3 or 4 questions about autonomy and decision-making power. Maybe it's, you know, you need this or something else. And this is where I would come back to the results on vegetarianism and teetotalism. If it's a story about gender norms, there's no reason why the upper caste, and in particular the lower caste, should be more likely to be vegetarian and to be abstaining from alcohol in these more densely populated districts. These are behaviors which are directly associated with social status. Whereas female labor force participation, of course, could be working one way or the other. But these behaviors really are, you know, a story about the status. Okay, so now I have about 15 minutes. So we get to the final section of the paper. We're going to now, yeah.
Can you run the same regressions for the vegetarianism and teetotalism in the panel data
No, we
framework?
cannot, for
I
2
see.
reasons. One is these are 2 different segments of the NSS.
They're
But
not
the
asked
more
every
important,
year?
the bigger concern is that if you have, for example, either alcoholism or teetotalism, these are basically, this is consumption demand, right? You would need to have prices, etc., on the right-hand side. And the problem is that then our instruments would surely fail the exclusion restriction with those.
Yeah, but I'm saying, but.
Because they would have these, you would have this unobserved, because if you think about a standard demand equation, right, you would want to put the prices on the right-hand side. That's the issue. And the prices are going to obviously be affected by rainfall shocks. That's the issue. So we don't go down that road over here. We just stay with the cross-sectional analysis for this part of the analysis. Okay. So now, what are we going to do now? We're going to basically take our very simple model and we're going to use that model to see whether it can actually explain the changes in female labor force non-participation over time, as well as in the cross-section across districts. And this is going to help us then, through the lens of the model, explain why female labor force non-participation has increased over time. And then we're going to examine alternative policies that could potentially reduce the female labor force non-participation. Now, at this point, we're going to augment the simple analytical model in 2 ways. The first is that when we were testing the predictions of the model with that instrument, we knew that the wages were endogenous, but we were dealing with that with the statistical instrument. Now, at this point, we can't do that. So we're going to have to endogenize the wages. So we're going to actually write down a general equilibrium model. We're going to endogenize the wages. We're going to have a production side as well. The second thing is that, remember at the very beginning, I talked about the change in education for women over time. And we want to ultimately explain why it is the case that even though education increased, female labor force non-participation continued to increase as well. So we're going to add an education component to the model as well. Okay, but otherwise, the basic structure of the model is going to stay exactly as it is. Okay, so this is the structure of the model. It's very similar to what you saw earlier, so I'm going to go over it very quickly. The difference is now that earlier you had the woman and the man at 1 unit of time. For the man, all of that time was devoted to work, and that was it. For the woman, it was divided up into staying at home and going into the labor market. Now what we're going to do is to allow for that 1 unit of time to be divided up into skilled tasks and unskilled tasks. And within each of those, for the woman, some fraction of that time will be put into the market, and the remainder will be kept at home. So we're going to basically get now measures of female labor force non-participation separately for educated and uneducated, for example. We'll also be able to endogenize the fraction of educated women and the fraction of educated men. Okay, and that is this, I don't know what that is called, a psi. That's the psi function. Okay, the psi term. So what about, but then once you do that, and once you have education, there has to be a cost of education as well. So we're going to have a cost of education function over there as well. Okay, so what is the household's potential income now? The household's potential income now is just as it was earlier, except that we're now allowing for the possibility that it's going to have skilled and unskilled time as well, or education. You're going to be, now remember, in the model, it's within 1 unit of time. This maps in the data into the fraction of households for a given caste and a given gender who are educated versus not being educated. Okay, that's the standard kind of macro thing, going from the representative household to the sort of data that we have. Okay, it's the same idea. Now, the other thing I want to talk about here is the cost of education. So this is now, we're going to write this down, so the cost of signaling. We're going to write this down explicitly now as a product of the wage, and separately now for the skilled and the unskilled. And then tau is a fraction of time, let us say for the unskilled person, that is withdrawn from the labor force. So that's the cost. And then we have this eta parameter. So what is this eta parameter? So in our model, we are basically ignoring, for example, all the standard things, like, for example, this trade-off between income and leisure, home production, gender norms. All of those things are going to go into this eta parameter, which is less than 1. And this is kind of a dampener on essentially the cost of withdrawing out. So think about this intuitively. If there are very strong gender norms, which make a woman, for example, it's very costly for the household to make her work because of these very strong gender norms, for example, then eta is going to be very low, because that means it's less costly for the household to withdraw her from the labor market. Alternatively, for example, if she's very valuable at home, she's doing all sorts of good things at home, then again, it's less costly for the household to withdraw from the labor market. And so therefore, eta is going to go down. What's going to happen over time, we think, is that this is not going to, the value of her time, etc., is not going to change very much. But these gender norms are going to weaken. And as a result, this eta parameter is going to, we would expect, is going to increase. But in our model, one limitation of this particular specification, as you will see, is that we can never shut down the status component completely. Because if we shut down the status motivation, then all the women are surely going to work. There's no other choice for them. If you really wanted to have a trade-off between working and staying back home, you would need to have an additional additive term for you, which would then incorporate, for example, the value of her leisure, home production, etc., but coming in separately and not in this multiplicative way. And we haven't quite estimated that model yet. This is the model that you have right now, okay? Just to let you know, but we are working on this as we go forward. But this eta parameter is super important, as you will see. Okay, so now this is exactly as we had earlier, except we allow for a different number of low caste and high caste households in the village. They're not of equal numbers. And given this, we can solve out from those first order conditions. We can derive expressions for the value of the education share, which is those etas, as well as the female labor force non-participation for the educated women and the uneducated women as functions of the caste and gender specific wages and the parameters of the model. And so this is what we did is earlier as well in the model, when we were solving out the model, right? So if we took the wages as exogenous, then we could solve these equations simultaneously and solve for all of these things. But the problem is, of course, the wages are not obviously exogenous. You need to endogenize the wages as well. So what we do in the structural model is to also then have a production cycle. So how do we pin down the wages? We're going to assume that the status game is going to be played at the level of the village, so that N is a finite number. Okay, but the labor market is going to be specified at the level of the district. So there is essentially a very large number, a continuum of households at the level of the district. And each district is going to consist of a homogeneous set of villages. So each village in a given district time period has a fraction XL of low caste households. And this corresponds to a mass XL of low caste households in the district, with XH equal to 1 minus XL. So this we can observe in the data, okay? So we know what this is. So once we have this, then we can write down your aggregate production function, okay? And this is very simple, it's a linear aggregate production function. A is total factor productivity. So this is where the population density comes in. We assume that A is a function of population density, and above over here, we assume that V over there is a function of population density. This is the only source of variation in the exogenous variation in the structural model. And everything else is going to be endogenized. The wages are going to be endogenized, the education is endogenized, the female labor force non-participation is endogenized. And so once you have this, you basically, this is your standard nested CES structure. So you can basically write down the aggregate labor supply as a function of the skill, caste, gender level inputs, labor inputs. Okay, so once you have this, then you can basically write down an expression for the wages. Okay, and what you get is a function is that wages can be derived as functions of the education and the female labor force non-participation. So what I told you earlier was you can derive expressions for the education and the female labor force non-participation from the status equation earlier as functions of the wages. And now you can write down the wages as functions of these objects. So how do we now solve these two things simultaneously? The way we do that is basically we take a guess for the wages. And then given the wages, we can solve for the labor force participation and the education, etc. Given that, we can then solve for the wages. And obviously, that's not going to match with what we guessed. So we're going to go back and we're going to keep iterating until we get convergence. So this is how we solve the model, the general equilibrium version. But this is for a given set of parameters. So then what we do is we search across the entire space of parameters. There's a lot of parameters, about 37 parameters. So it's not an easy problem to work with. We search across all the set of parameters to find a set that matches most closely with the data. Okay, and now there are many moments to match them. Okay, but basically one way to check how well we are matching is to compare the prediction of the model for education, wages, and female labor force non-participation with the actual data itself. And if it was exactly on spot on, then it would be along the 45-degree line. And you can see here that we're not doing so badly at all, right? It's a very simple model, but we're able to match the data very well. Another way to check this is to look at this in the cross-section as well as over time. And I'm just showing this to you here for the female labor force non-participation. I could show this to you for education and wages, and you would get an even better fit. So we are able to fit the data actually very well with this simple model. Okay? And once you've estimated the model, then we can also go back and check one of the key assumptions of our analysis, which is that the value of status is increasing in population density. And this comes out of our model as well. Okay, so now this is, hopefully this will tell you that this model is doing a reasonable job of matching the data over these different NSS routes. Another question is, okay, so now what is it that actually increased? Remember here, we can see that the female labor force non-participation is increasing. Yeah.
What is the exogenous thing that is changing those decisions over time?
The only thing that's changing over time is exogenously. The only thing is the population density is fixed.
Population, yeah, exactly.
So the only thing that's going to be changing, as you will see, are the cost of education parameters and the ETA.
Right.
No, we also the productivity. So the productivity parameters are also changing. So the productive parameters are changing over time because the place is becoming more productive. The PFP is going up, and then the V could be changing over time. And the ETA could be changing. And you're going to see that in a second. And the cost of education, right? So all of these things are going to be estimated in each round separately, right? We estimate each round separately, the parameters.
I see.
So all the parameters of the model.
What are the parameters that are like explaining those changes?
So those, now we're going to look at this.
Yeah,
Exactly. That's the next step. So first thing is, first of all, what is it? So in this version of the model, the only way that the female labor force non-participation can increase over time, because of the way that ETA comes in multiplicatively, the only way is through the status mechanism. And that's a bit of a weakness. What you would really like to do is to allow for the possibility that over time, for example, as productivity went up, as income went up, for example, women just withdrew from the labor force because the value of their leisure just went up. And that's kind of shut down. So that's why I would really like to do that other specification as well. But for the moment, we are left with this. But we can still say, okay, what is it about the status that is changing over time and increasing over time? And in our model, there are three ways that this could happen. Either V is going to increase, Y bar is going to increase, or delta Y is going to decrease. These are the three things. And if you look at the delta Y, which is this red thing, that's not changing over time. So that's not responsible. It's basically V and Y bar, which are increasing over time. And that in some ways is a sad story because guess what? This is just development. As an economy develops, incomes are going to increase. That's just what development is all about. As an economy develops and you get better hospitals and better schools, then guess what? The value of state is going to increase until the time when the market kicks in and starts to allocate differently. But in the medium term, these things are increasing. So the question is, what could you do in this kind of situation? And by the way, these things are a bit clunky. This needs to be fixed. Okay, so we haven't quite done the estimation. We're re-estimating the model. So there are problems with the cost of education function, as you can see. But I think the basic results are the same. So the first thing I want you to take away from this, you ask me, what is changing over time? So what's changing over time, apart from the productivity term, they're going to increase the wages, which in our model is going to just basically increase the total status through the Y bar. At this point, it's uninteresting. There's no trade-off. But what is changing over here, which is kind of interesting, is the cost of education, as you might imagine, has been going down. This is for females. And this ETA parameter has been going up. And what I would interpret this as saying is that over time, what's happening is, remember, ETA is this kind of thing which dampens the cost of withdrawing off of the labor market. So when you have very strong gender norms, in some sense, it's not really costly for the household to withdraw the woman from the labor market, because what would it do? If it went, they've sent her to the labor market, they would be big trouble in some sense, right? So as a result of that, the effective cost of withdrawing from the labor market is very low. And so when they have to withdraw like crazy to actually have a substantial cost. So these are the two things that we can actually play with. So the first thing we do is we say, suppose we actually, instead, you see this cost of education is going down over time. Suppose in the last year, in 2011, we reduced the cost of education even further. What would have happened to female labor force non-participation? And you're comparing the black line, which is the benchmark, to the red line, which is the counterfactual. And what you find is that in fact, things would get worse. And that gets back to the initial figure that I showed you. And the intuition for this is that basically what's happening now is that when you reduce the cost of education, the household's potential income has gone up. And as a result, Y bar goes up, is going to invest more in the status game. The one change, the one policy lever that is actually more promising is this one over here. This has been increasing over time. Suppose we increase it by a further 20%. Then what you see is that female labor force non-participation would have gone down. And the reason for that is because what is ETA doing? It's basically when ETA goes up, it makes every unit of time that you withdraw the women from the labor market now becomes more costly. So in some sense, the status game becomes more efficient. You can signal by withdrawing her less from the labor market. And as a result, in equilibrium, the level of female labor force non-participation is going to actually go down. Now, the problem with this is great. I mean, this tells you what you want to focus on. Basically, what you do not want to do is to have a policy that gives a monetary incentive to the household, which increases its potential income. For example, you don't want to tell the woman's family, guess what, if she works, you will give her a bonus by working. That's the worst kind of thing you could do, because that's just going to make them invest more in the status game because their potential income has gone up. Everybody knows that. So now when they don't work, everyone says, wow, they're foregoing all this income. They must be super wealthy, you know? So that's what you don't want to do. So what you really want to do is to do this. Yeah.
Or you can make work hidden.
Work hidden, precisely. So I want to get to that because
Yeah.
now the question is, how do you actually do this? How do you actually implement? How could you ever? Because the thing with norms in general is how do you actually change norms? I had this really old paper on fertility norms in Bangladesh. And so the idea in that paper was that basically when norms break down, it's kind of a dynamic process where, it's a bit like a story about network formation or network decay. As more and more people start to deviate from the norms, it becomes in some sense cheaper for you to deviate as well, or less costly. And so there's this so if you can initiate the process because of this sort of multiplier effect, you can really get people to move out of this norm. So there is a role for policy here. What you would really want to do is to somehow encourage or incentivize some women to get out of the labor force. But you can't use money. That's the problem in this particular context. In other contexts, you could use money, and that would be good because you just basically give them enough incentive, financial incentive, to actually deviate. Here, you don't want to do that. So this is where the working at home comes in.
Yeah.
What you really want to do is if you make her work, if you offer her a job outside the house, then that's a visible thing. The household's potential income has gone up. Everybody observes that. So when the household doesn't send her to work, it's a really strong signal of that. But if you give her a job at home, that doesn't really change anything because that is not observed by anybody else outside of the household. And the advantage of this is that if you give her this income at home, her bargaining power in the household is nevertheless going to increase. And so this might very well be a way to actually get it, I think. I think information problems with information policy interventions in this setting are not going to do anything because these households know the labor market. It's not that they don't know that jobs are available. They know that jobs are available. They know what's out there. They just choose not to do it. You need to somehow, get them out of this equilibrium.
Then I was gonna say, until you have the missing markets filling in, you still need some kind of, there's still gonna be some other
Some
thing,
allocation.
some other allocation problem. that
Absolutely. So what are you going to use
You
instead?
need some alternative like status.
Let them be
symbol.
vegetarian.
Yeah.
Let them be
maybe it's
vegetarian. Let them not drink, alcohol. These are perfectly good things to do. they'll be healthier and they'll be wealthier as well because they're going to reduce their consumption on these, things. I think that's perfect. They just shut down this one, signal that they're using.
Interesting, the COVID thing and the whole shift of labor to in-house, like,
Yeah.
it probably affected this, I guess.
Well, so there is a very interesting paper which you guys might know, right? This Ho and Jalota. Do you know this
Yeah.
paper? Where they make them work at home.
That's what.
And what they find is that if you even double the household's, the woman's wages, they still don't affect on her labor force.
Yeah.
It's completely in line with our story. But if you give her work at home, that they will take.
Yeah.
So I think that, I mean, I think we have a kind of, internally consistent story for this, obviously, this very big puzzle. Okay, let me stop you. I have 5 minutes over. And I've exhausted all of you, I'm sure. So,
I should have asked this when you put the picture up for Asia. Did you have China in your scour plot?
Oh, you know what? Do you have the paper? We have this list.
Oh,
Oh, there's a list in the-
There's in the appendix, there's a list of countries.